examining medieval food supplies in London, and you'll also probably know from the magnificent volume The Dublin Region in the Middle Ages, which is quite intimidating in size and in every way nearly. So I'd like to hand over to Margaret now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. I must preface my presentation by saying that I'm not an environmental historian, or at least I would not describe myself as an environmental historian. I do work in the areas of settlement and agricultural history, which of course have clear affinities with environmental history. I'm particularly interested in the relationships between town and country, between urban and rural dwellers. So the material that I'm presenting here today is part of ongoing research on that topic, the relationship between town and country in medieval Ireland. So it is very much part of a wider piece of work, and it is very much work in progress. If you approach that relationship between town and country from the perspective of an economic or an agrarian historian, you do tend to focus on the beneficial parts of that relationship. And towns did have many beneficial impacts on their surrounding areas or their hinterlands. They, of course, provided markets and marketing opportunities for agrarian products. Towns could stimulate the countryside in various ways. It could stimulate towards intensification and also towards specialisation. Towns, in their turn, supplied manufactured and imported goods to rural consumers and offered opportunities for employment, for education and for leisure. So there are some of the beneficial parts of the relationship. Towns also had negative impacts on their surrounding areas, and by and large it's those more negative impacts that I'm going to be concentrating on. Medieval society was fundamentally and very blatantly hierarchical. We see that on a number of different levels. Medieval town dwellers believed that they were inherently better than country dwellers. And I suppose to some extent one might say that throughout the centuries, urban dwellers have always had that certain sense of superiority. The implication of this was that urban dwellers saw nothing wrong in both using and adapting the countryside for their needs. And they also saw nothing wrong in banishing outside of their walls anything that was negatively affecting the quality of life within those walls. Walls are actually a recurring leitmotif in this paper. I'll be mentioning them on several occasions. But walls were important. They defined the urban environment. They allowed townspeople to underscore the essential dichotomy that a town was what the countryside was not. This image of the ideal medieval town or medieval city from the Luttrell Psalter shows the town with its strong walls enclosing the sturdy stone houses and the churches of the town. The only movement, the only flow in this image is the line of happy dancing folk who were either going into the city or coming out of the city. We're not sure. This was far from the truth, however. Towns frequently limited entrance through their gates, and they regularly forced people out, removed them from the privilege of urban living, or at least urban living within the walls. Now, some of the people who were thrown out of towns, like criminals and prostitutes, were judged to have forfeited their rights to live in the towns by their activities. Others were more innocent victims. Towns banished lepers, beggars, vagrants, and the undeserving poor of various kinds. Some continental towns forced out unmarried women from inside the walls, unless they were in domestic service, perceiving them as a threat to the order in the town, and perhaps to the employment opportunities for men in the town. In Irish towns, Irish men and women also were liable to have their urban rights withdrawn at various times. So in 1458, for example, the municipal authorities of Dublin ordained that Irish men and those who had beards above the mouth, which seems to have meant the same thing, Irish men, or perhaps people who affected the facial hair habits of the Irish. Anyway, these people were to be removed from the town. They were not to be allowed to stay within the walls. They and their horses and their horseboys were to be ejected. The ejection of humans from towns is an interesting topic, and of course it's one that had potential impacts on settlement and the environment of the surrounding areas, particularly the suburban areas. But I want to talk more about noxious substances rather than noxious citizens. But the removal of noxious substances was in some ways governed by the same sorts of considerations. It was seen as necessary for the safety of the town, for the appearance of the town. Ejection of wastes emphasised the progress, the civility, and the urbanity of the town. And it was frequently affected with little or no concern for the environment outside of the walls. Improving the environment within medieval towns was, however, an uphill task. Whatever the illusion of order created by the walls and towers, inside presented rather a different picture. This is another image of a medieval town entitled The Topsy-Turvy World by Bruegel, middle of the 16th century. Now, of course, this, just as the previous slide, is an allegorical ideal representation. This is very much at the other end of the scale. And in fact, an alternative name for it is Netherlandish proverbs, because if you look around, you see people doing rather strange things, and they're all supposed to be illustrating various proverbs. So for here, you have the man knocking his head against a wall, etc., etc. Just want to draw your attention to the river here, and to the activity going on in this building situated sort of overhanging the river. We'll be sort of returning to that particular image in a little while. Okay, to turn to Ireland and medieval Irish towns. Just want to say just a few things about urbanisation in Ireland. Following the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in 1170 and throughout the 13th century, Ireland went through a period of very rapid urbanisation. So during this period, the 5 existing port towns, founded by the Vikings, were greatly expanded. Of course, it's Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick. But around 50 more towns, both port towns and inland towns, were founded, all within a relatively short period of time. Now, the spread of urbanisation was obviously very uneven. There were large parts of Ireland that were unaffected by it. But in some parts, it reached quite a high level. It's possible that in these areas, and I'm talking about obviously parts of the east, but also parts of the south, particularly the areas, the river valley areas of the south. In these areas, it's possible that 10% or more of the population lived in towns. Now, obviously, figures like that are not based on very hard statistics. We don't know what the population of the country as a whole was, never mind what the population of many individual towns was, but I think it's quite plausible that we're looking at a figure of 10% or perhaps more. By far the largest urban settlement was Dublin, whose population at the end of the 13th century probably reached 10,000 and may have been more. A number of other towns may have had populations between 3,000 to 6,000. Now, these are not very large towns. We're not talking about towns on the scale of Paris or London, but they are large enough to have had an impact. Consider this statistic, and this is a proper statistic. An urban centre of 5,000 people had annually to get rid of some 250 tonnes of solids and 2,500 tonnes of liquid human wastes or sewerage. Every year, 250 tonnes of solids and 2,500 tonnes of liquid human wastes. We can double that figure for Dublin for a start. Medieval towns were also full of horses, belonging to residents and visitors, cart horses, riding horses, horses that operated horse mills, horses associated with castle garrisons. Mary Beard, in her wonderful study of Pompeii, reckoned that the horses in Pompeii produced up to 10 kilos of dung per day. And I suspect that the Irish horses would have been doing something fairly similar. Less spectacular outputs came from the dogs, cats, pigs, etc. that roamed the streets. Now, this clearly presented a problem. Regulation of urban waste involved the development of techniques to manage individual and group behaviour. These techniques evolved in some degree in pace with the growth of a town. So the bigger an urban settlement, the bigger the problem waste disposal was, and the more complex the mechanism of controls had to be. It's clear that over time as well there was more concern about municipal authorities and many medieval town dwellers themselves about the appearance and the smell of their towns. This was, of course, linked to a concern to limit the spread of disease and create a healthier environment for residents and visitors. The strategies adopted by towns of differing sizes tended to follow the same pattern or progression. So for some medieval towns, we have a very good set of surviving legislation which allows us to chart that progression. But we can imagine that for other towns, smaller towns and towns with less good surviving sources, the same progression was followed. So London, for example, the earliest legislation there comes from the 12th century, and it concerns the positioning of individual cesspits. in relation to property boundaries. Thereafter, we start to get legislation about the behaviour of food sellers in the marketplace. They come under scrutiny, particularly the butchers and the fishmongers. In the 13th century, the city started providing its citizens with a number of public latrines, and there were designated dumping places for dung and other rubbish, although it was still up to each householder to gather and dispose of his or her waste. In the 14th century, occupations connected with waste disposal emerge. So you start to get rakers of dung being named, and also the scavengers, the people who supervised the rakers of dung. The 15th century was characterised by yet more complex municipal arrangements, as well as the appearance of entrepreneurial individuals to whom the work was contracted out. So, for example, in 1466, one John Lovelock agreed to clean all the privies within the city and liberties of London for a term of 10 years. He was well paid for this enormous task. The same chronology of waste regulation can be seen with reference to much smaller urban centres. In Dublin, again, the earliest enactments that we have were made in the 13th century, and they concerned cesspits. It was stipulated that cesspits were not to be sited within 2 foot 6 inches of a neighbour's property. These cesspits, and a number of them have been identified in urban excavations, were usually about 3 to 4 foot deep. They were often lined with wickerwork, sometimes with masonry. And as you can see there from one, cesspit in York, they're sometimes found with the seating arrangements still in situ. Everything was thrown into these cesspits, although medieval householders actually produced very little food waste. Anything that wasn't eaten by humans could usually be diverted to animals. But into the cesspits you would find bones being thrown, ashes from the fire, broken pottery, etc. Sometimes people inadvertently lost possessions in these, so they found pieces of jewellery, for example, shoes, quite often found in cesspits. You can imagine retrieving fallen in wouldn't be very pleasant. When the pits were full, they were either closed up and a new one was dug, or they were emptied. In the 14th century, we learn of some Dublin houses with indoor latrines. In 1317, Mayor and Commonalty of Dublin made an agreement with a couple who were tenants of a number of houses built on the wall of the city near the tower at the end of Bridge Street. And it's this area up here. This is Bridge Street, so these houses were somewhere here, very close to the river. They were given permission to re-edify the houses by the addition of, among other things, latrines. They were also granted a latrine which had already been constructed in one of these houses. So that's the couple there, John Gronsett and his wife, a latrine already built with a drain through the middle of the open wall towards the water of the Arla fee. Annual rent, 12 pence of silver. If arrears accrue, the city is empowered to distrain by a destruction of the latrine, which would have been quite an effective method for getting your rent paid. Religious houses might be equipped with a number of latrines. The Augustinian canons of Christchurch had a latrine in a building known as Col Fabias. In the 16th century, this was described as equipped with 6 seats and a window. It's not clear where the effluent from this building opened out to, But in the early 14th century, there was a very large fine levied on people who allowed their latrines to be opened out into the streets. So the latrines, if not positioned very close to the river, had to be directed into a ditch or a drain which led down to the river. There was a public or common privy at Isolde's Tower overlooking the river, and that is situated just down here. And we hear later on of two other common privies, one of them in Fishamble Street and another of them built just outside one of the west gates to the city. Public latrines could be expensive to maintain. The one on the Ouse Bridge at York cost 13 shillings and 8 pence annually, plus there was money expended on lights so that the building could be lit at night, and obviously the people who cleaned it out had to be paid. Some enlightened individuals left bequests in their wills for the improvement of public facilities. In London, a large easement house with facilities for both men and women was funded by a bequest of Dick Whittington, the former mayor. I didn't come across any mayors of Dublin leaving similar bequests. As far as possible, therefore, direct aquatic disposal was seen as the best method of getting rid of human effluent. And again, returning to the Bruegel drawing, this building here, it's obviously a tree building positioned right over the river here, and it's illustrating the Netherlandish proverb that to hang like a privy over a ditch means it is obvious. Everybody knows this is where you would find it. There appears little concern about the effect that this effluent has on the river, or any attempt to take in Dublin to take account of the tidal nature of the Liffey. So stuff going into the Liffey could be washed up and then come back down again. And it must have been deeply unpleasant for people working on the river, fishing or travelling. Not surprisingly, another common medieval adage or saying was that bridges were made for wise men to go over and fools to go under. So if you're travelling in a boat, you want to be very careful at the time that you go under bridges. Other rubbish, including animal dung, ashes, sweepings and byproducts of the food trade like guts, viscera and feathers, had to be disposed of. A certain amount of this type of rubbish was also thrown into rivers, but by the 15th century most towns passed legislation requiring town dwellers to arrange for their rubbish to be brought outside of the town walls for dumping. People found dumping rubbish inside the walls were fined. In Waterford in 1475, it was enacted that no man, woman or child should push no manner of dung, rammel or filth into the river, over no quay nor slip of the city, not into St. Mary's Street, neither into the King's Ditches nor beside them, from the market cross onto Arundel's Gate upon pain of 4pence. So that obviously tells us that up to this time and possibly beyond it, people were dumping in all of these places. Up to the 15th century, householders in Irish towns were still responsible for their own waste disposal, but there was more oversight by municipal authorities, and the period saw the emergence of carters and carmen who specialised in the work of moving rubbish. Authorities soon realised, however, that legislating for people to dump their rubbish outside the walls resulted in a very literal interpretation of outside the walls. Literally, people would get outside a gate and immediately dump their rubbish. So great mounds of rubbish started to build up right at the gateways into cities. Very nice welcome for visitors. In 1400, the mounds of waste lying just outside the gates of the city of Paris were so high that they restricted passage, and also posed a security threat because people could just climb up on these mounds and hop over the walls and get into the city. One ingenious regulation that the Parisian authorities came up with was that whoever brought a cart of sand, earth or gravel into the city had to leave with a cart of rubbish or refuse. In Dublin also we see the same carters who are handling things like clay and stuff that's being brought in for the building trade. They're also people who are transporting dung and rubbish. In order to stop citizens dumping right at the gates, in the 15th century Dublin authorities designated 3 great holes or pits in suburban areas where citizens could bring their dung. And I've marked the location of those 3 great pits on this map here on Town Clock's maps. Not surprisingly, there isn't a couldn't find a symbol that meant great dung pit, so they put stars. One of these pits was in the northern suburb of Oxman Town, was supposed to be located just beyond Hangman Lane, that's Hammond Lane now, in this area up here. Another, the stars have actually shifted a little bit. But another was supposed to be located on Hoggan Green, which is an area in the eastern suburb of the city. And the third one was located outside the west gates of the city, near to the Franciscan Friary, which is here, and the Fair Green there, which is where the Dublin Fair is held. Carters and carmen who charged more than a penny to draw 2 carts or 4 cars of dung out of the city were fined. Some citizens tried to get out of paying fines by claiming that it was their lazy servants or apprentices who had emptied out the dung as soon as they got outside of the walls. But this too was covered in legislation, so people were made responsible for their servants when their servants were dumping rubbish. Things were no better in Kilkenny. In the 16th century, the Corporation of Irish Town passed regulation after regulation requiring citizens to clear away the large dunghills in the streets. One piece of legislation stated that no inhabitant shall keep any dung or filth in the streets before their doors or in the ways near the gates of the town. And then rather you get a sense of exasperation in the legislation, especially upon the coming of the Lord Deputy hither. Because an important visitor is being expected. And it goes on to say that there are particular days of the year when people are to try and make sure that the streets are clean. That's on Corpus Christi, the feast day of St. Canis, St. Patrick's Day, Christmas and Easter. Now obviously these would be days when religious processions would have been held through the streets of the town, so it's particularly important then to have the streets very clean. Now lest people think that the inhabitants of the High Town or the English town in Kilkenny were any better behaved, I would direct them towards the Liber Primus of Kilkenny, which has regulations trying to curb behaviour of some of the citizens in that part of the town. who were found committing enormities in the public drinking fountains of the town, and also washing guts and innards of animals in those same drinking fountains. So the visits of important people was sometimes a spur to action. The appearance of the town could deter people from visiting. In 1489 it was reported that Dublin was so filthy and full of muck heaps that officers of the king were loath to go there. Now, of course, much of this rubbish would not have posed a serious threat to the environment. So it was unpleasant, it was obviously very smelly, but it wasn't dangerous. In fact, some of it was very beneficial. The vegetable gardens of town dwellers benefited greatly from application of dung. Sometimes carters did not have to go very far to get rid of their cargoes. In Dublin, those gardeners who received a load of dung had to ensure that it was dug into the soil of their gardens within a day or risk prosecution. But further out, arable land in the hinterland surely also benefited from city waste. Some English towns sold their dung, but many made it freely available for those who would come in and take it away. Now, of course, this habit of rural fields being manured with urban wastes went on for very many centuries, and one of the good description of it was written in the 19th century by Victor Hugo in his novel. He writes, "Those heaps of filth at the gateposts, those tumbrils of mud which jog through the streets by night, those terrible casks of the street carpet, those fetid droppings of subterranean mire, which the pavements hide from you. Do you know what they are? They are the meadow and flower, the green grass, wild thyme and sage. They are game, they are cattle, they are the satisfied bellows of great oxen in the evening. They are perfumed hay, they are golden wheat, they are the bread on your table, they are the warm blood in your veins, they are health, they are joy, they are life." So really evoking there the benefits of the city waste. And here I have to acknowledge Dr. Richard Jones at the University of Leicester, who brought this to my attention, and also this nice image from the Luttrell Soldier again of a fruitful dunghill. What a rare image. You don't get very many images of dunghills, but this is very clearly one, and you can see it's supporting this great fruitfulness of animal life, this great ecosystem. Okay, unlike the useful dung, the effluents of some urban crafts and trades were potentially quite harmful to the environment. Again, the strategy adopted by towns was to try to move both the people practicing these trades outside of the walls, and also to legislate against their dumping waste in watercourses. Tanning was a particularly noxious craft, and one that had a very urban profile, given the need for animal hides, which were usually sourced from urban butchers. Tanning involved various processes, most of which required water and all of which were malodorous. Firstly, the hides were washed, then they were left to sit long enough for the hair follicles to rot and loosen. This process could and was catalysed by the addition of urine, ash or lime. Once the hair had been loosened and scraped away, the lime would be removed, usually by washing it, and the hide softened by being immersed in a vat of bird dung, dog excrement, urine or stale beer. The hide would be washed once more before being placed and regularly agitated in a pit of weak tanning liquor, and finally being left for up to a year or more in a pit containing vegetable remains such as oak bark or wood chips and water. So all parts of the process involved the creation of a lot of waste products. Tanners were active in Dublin from at least the 11th century, and the frequency with which the occupational designation tanner is encountered in the documentary sources from the late 12th century onwards is a measure of the importance of the process in the region. Many tanners are listed in the Dublin Guild Merchant Roll for the late 12th, 13th century, and later on in the Dublin City Franchise Roll for the 15th and early 16th century. We also find quit toyers or tanners mentioned as well, which indicates that this process, whereby the hides were tanned with alum in order to produce a white leather, that process was also undertaken in the Dublin area. There's lots of archaeological evidence of medieval tanning in and around Dublin. Excavations on Patrick Street revealed an oak-staved tanning pit that seems to have been part of a large 13th century tanning complex on the banks of the Poddle River. The pit contained substance which may have been lime, while 5 small wooden barrels which were recovered near the pit contained wood chips and bark, which were very likely residue from the tanning process. Excavations at the Coombe in 2004 revealed several pits containing organic waste, 2 of which had wooden barrels at their base. Again, these pits seem to have been used for tanning, while nearby 2 circular pits and another stone-lined pit contained fills of lime. The excavators reported a strong smell of urea from one of these, suggesting that it may have been used for soaking hides. Another possible tannery was uncovered near the banks of the Poddle on New Street South. The street immediately behind the site is called Black Pits, which almost certainly derives from the pits or vats of dark tanning material in which the hides would have been steeped. The site consisted of almost 200 on-lined circular and rectangular pits, so this was a very large operation. About half of them were medieval, the other half were 17th century date. Many of them still contained dark organic fills with bark chips, vegetation, and smelled strongly of ammonia. The pits were connected to the Poddle by a series of drains and channels. Oxmantown, which formed the northern suburb of Dublin, was also a centre of tanning in the medieval period. Lands close to the river here were owned by tanners, and the area also had a number of leather workers and saddlers. Over time, there was a realisation that the runoff from these industries had a negative effect on the environment. This was noticed, of course, by those who were involved in river fishing, particularly salmon fishing. In 1466, the city authorities of Dublin legislated that tanners and glovers and anyone else who used lime were not to wash hides or leather in the River Liffey, as this practice was destroying the salmon. The fine was 3 shillings and 4pence, with half going to the teller. So it was encouraging people to actually tell the authorities when they saw this going on. In the 16th century, the Corporation of Galway passed a bylaw prohibiting the steeping of limed hides or flax in the River Corrib because, again, of the destruction of fish. The mention of flax there is an indication that the process of flax retting was going on beside these rivers. During this process, the flax itself is softened in order for the fibre to be extracted. It was usually done in ponds or in rivers. and it produced a runoff of water from it, which was a potent destroyer of fish life. Dublin also passes legislation forbidding anyone from introducing flax to the rivers or ditches. Now, I've mostly been talking about urban environmental impacts in the immediate surroundings of cities. But I'm just very briefly, and I'm conscious of the time, just want to mention the environmental impact that towns had beyond their immediate surroundings. Towns generated concentrated demand. They needed rural products to feed their inhabitants, to provide fuel for their hearths and kilns, to supply raw materials for industry, and also timber and stone for buildings. Natural local ecosystems at some remove from towns then could potentially experience their environmental impacts. So what might these impacts be? All production that is geared towards consumption elsewhere has an environmental cost. The nutrients in grain and animals that are consumed outside the rural areas are lost, and the use of urban effluents as fertilisers only partially redresses this. Over time, this loss of nutrients has a negative effect on fertility and sustainability. Now, a dramatic example of this might be the depletion of resources resulting in considerable landscape change. Were any medieval Irish towns big enough to bring about such dramatic change? Here we should remind ourselves that many Irish towns, particularly the port towns, but to some extent inland towns as well, were part of a colonial economic network. So at particular times, and particularly in the late 13th century and early 14th century, these towns were drawing on resources not just to feed their inhabitants, but also to service an export trade, and also a provisioning system which saw very large amounts of grain and livestock diverted out of the country to feed royal armies. So there is evidence that the techniques which were introduced into farming in order to intensify did result in some parts in soil exhaustion. And attempts to redress this negatively affected agriculture in general. So, for example, on several manors in the Dublin region, sods were cut out of meadow and pasture land in order that they could be dug into the arable land to increase fertility, which over time damaged the pasture and meadow land, and it only provided a very temporary boost to the fertility of the arable land. Dublin's demand for wood also affected areas at a far remove. And I'm sure Galisa was talking a bit about wood, the fact that urban demand could use up woodland very quickly, but that it also tended to stimulate the introduction of management techniques like coppicing. Okay, just a couple of general conclusions to this, and I'm very aware of the areas that I have not covered, like reclamation of land for building, several other aspects of water management which have a bearing on this topic as well. And we probably will be hearing about some of those referenced to towns in the later period tomorrow. Generally, what I found from doing this work was that medievalists can very usefully recognise that the development of urban communities was not just beneficial or socially important, but it also could impose costs on the human and natural environments around them. I also learned that we can actually learn a lot from our medieval forebears about things like sustainability. While we might react with horror to some of their attitudes towards waste disposal, I think that some of the modern mechanisms for getting rid of waste would probably provoke a similar reaction in our medieval forebears. Okay, thank you.